December 12th, 627 AD. A thick fog hangs over the ancient ruins of Nineveh, the graveyard of one of the oldest cities in human history, buried under the sands of Mesopotamia for more than 1,000 years. The air is cold, sharp, heavy with the smell of horses, iron, and fear. Two armies stand across from each other in the grey half-light. On one side, the battle-hardened cavalry of the Sassanid Persian Empire, the most powerful military machine in the known world, commanded by one of Persia's greatest generals, Khazad. On the other, a Roman army over 1,000 miles from home, deep inside enemy territory, with no supply lines, no allies, and no escape route. And at the head of that Roman army sits a single man on horseback, an emperor, Heraclius of Byzantium. The fog shifts, the armies clash. For 8 brutal hours, armored cavalry tear each other apart on the plain of Nineveh. The ground runs red, men and horses scream. Then it stops. A figure rides out from the Persian lines, Khazad, the commander of the Persian forces. He raises his weapon. He is not fleeing. He is not surrendering. He is issuing a challenge. One warrior to another, one leader to another. He is calling out the Emperor of Rome to meet him personally on the most dangerous battlefield in the world. What happened next has been recorded by Byzantine chroniclers, debated by scholars for over 1,000 years, and never, not once, matched in the entire history of the ancient world. The Emperor of Rome answered the call. He rode forward, he took a wound to the face, and the Persian commander fell. In one later Byzantine account, Heraclius fought multiple Persian opponents that day, and not one of them prevailed. This is the Battle of Nineveh. This is the story of the last great war of antiquity, and this is the brutal truth. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel and you want the kind of history they never taught you in school, the kind with blood, strategy, and impossible men doing impossible things, hit subscribe right now and ring that notification bell. We cover the wars, the battles, and the commanders that shaped the entire human story. This is Wars in History. Let's get into it. In the early 7th century AD, 2 empires ruled the known world. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, controlled the Mediterranean coast, Anatolia, Syria, and the Balkans. To its east, the Sassanid Persian Empire controlled Mesopotamia, Iran, and much of the ancient Near East. These 2 civilizations had been at war, on and off, for nearly 400 years. By 602 AD, they were about to fight the last war, and the most destructive one. What followed was 26 years of total conflict that brought both empires to the edge of extinction. Cities that had stood for centuries were burned, provinces changed hands, populations were massacred and enslaved. The spiritual heart of the Christian world was captured, and out of all that devastation, one man emerged, a Roman emperor who refused to accept that his civilization was finished, who rebuilt it from nothing, and who led it on one of the most audacious military campaigns in the history of warfare. His name was Heraclius, and what he did on a fog-drenched plain outside the ruins of ancient Nineveh in December 627 AD will take your breath away. 602 AD, Constantinople. A soldier stands over a dead emperor. His name is Phocas. He is a Thracian centurion from the Danube frontier, rough, brutal, and entirely without political training. His men have mutinied. They have marched on Constantinople, and now, on the shores of the Bosphorus, the body of Emperor Maurice lies beside the bodies of his 5 sons, all executed in sequence, each one forced to watch the last die before his own throat was cut. Maurice's head is displayed on a spike in the forum of the city. The Romans kneel before their new master. And across the empire, across the entire known world, the news travels like fire through dry grass. Rome is broken. The man who heard that news most clearly and understood it most completely was not in Constantinople. He was in the jeweled audience hall of a palace called Ctesiphon on the banks of the Tigris River, 1,200 miles to the east. His name was Khosrow II, and he was the king of kings of the Sassanid Persian Empire. Khosrow II was, by any measure, one of the most powerful rulers in the world. He commanded an empire that stretched from Mesopotamia and Iran across to Central Asia, from the mountains of Armenia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. At its height, under his conquests, it would reach even further, as far as Egypt and the shores of the Mediterranean. His capital, Ctesiphon, was one of the largest cities on earth. His treasury was legendary, and his army, the Sassanid war machine, was terrifyingly effective. Its elite corps was the Azwaran cavalry, armored horsemen riding armored horses, their entire bodies sheathed in lamellar plate, carrying lances powerful enough, contemporary sources noted, to skewer 2 men at once. They were supplemented by thousands of highly trained archers who could saturate an enemy formation with arrows before the heavy cavalry drove through the chaos. Khosrow had a pretext ready-made. Before Phocas seized power, the previous emperor, Maurice, had been Khosrow's personal benefactor. Years earlier, Maurice had helped restore Khosrow to his throne after a rebellion nearly destroyed him. The 2 men had made an agreement, almost a personal pact. And now Maurice was dead, murdered by a usurper. Khosrow declared that he was going to war to avenge his friend. It was, of course, a political fiction. What he saw was opportunity, and he did not intend to waste it. The Persian flood that followed was one of the most devastating military campaigns in the ancient world. In 611 AD, Persian armies swept into Byzantine Syria. In 613, Damascus fell, one of the great commercial cities of the entire Roman East. In 614, the unthinkable happened. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, the city of the resurrection, the city at the absolute center of the spiritual universe of millions of Christians, was taken by storm after a 3-week siege. Ancient sources record that as many as 57,000 people were killed in the massacre that followed. Another 35,000 were deported east into Persia as slaves, including the patriarch of the city himself. Churches were burned, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was badly damaged, and the Persian troops carefully packed onto wagons the most sacred relic in all of Christendom, the true cross. The wood upon which, according to the faith of every Roman citizen, Jesus Christ himself had been crucified. It was carried away east to the treasury of Khosrow II as a trophy of conquest. For the Roman world, this was not merely a military defeat, it was a sign from God. It was proof that the divine had turned its face away, that Rome had been abandoned. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. People wept in the streets of Constantinople. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem, the lifeblood of the Christian faith for 3 centuries, ceased overnight, and the Persians did not stop. By 619 AD, Egypt had fallen. Egypt, the ancient, incomprehensibly fertile province that had fed the city of Rome itself for 600 years, was now under Persian control. With it went the grain supply of Constantinople. Citizens began to go hungry in the capital. By 620, Persian cavalry had pushed deep into Asia Minor. Persian forces had already reached Chalcedon, a city on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus Strait, directly across the water from Constantinople itself. Standing on the walls of their own capital, Roman citizens could look out across that narrow stretch of water and see the campfires of the enemy burning. Persia was not at the gates of Rome. Persia was close enough to spit across the water at it. Into this catastrophe, into this absolute nadir of Roman power, sailed a fleet from the port of Carthage in North Africa in October 610 AD. Its commander was the son of the Roman governor of Africa. His name was Heraclius. He was approximately 35 years old. He carried an icon of the Virgin Mary at the prow of his flagship. He sailed into the harbor of Constantinople, deposed Phocas, had him executed, and seized the throne of the Roman Empire. And then he looked around at the ruins of what had been handed to him, and he got to work. What Heraclius did over the following years was nothing short of extraordinary. He did not panic. He did not negotiate from weakness, though the Persians pushed to within sight of his capital. He did not flee, though his advisors, according to ancient sources, at one point urged him to abandon Constantinople entirely and move his government to Carthage. Instead, he reorganized, he rebuilt, he did things no emperor before him had done. He halved the salaries of government officials, he levied emergency taxes, he imposed forced loans on the wealthy. He went personally to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Sergius, and said, bluntly, "I need the treasure of the church." Every gold and silver object, candelabras, altarpieces, holy vessels, was melted down and struck into coins. Precious metals were stripped from the monuments of the city. Even the great Hagia Sophia was not spared. Contemporary chroniclers record the soldiers prying the silver plate from its walls. The church gave it all willingly, because Patriarch Sergius understood that if Constantinople fell to pagan Persia, there would be no church left to protect. Thousands of volunteers answered the call to arms, inspired by sermons declaring that fighting the Persians was not merely a political duty, it was a sacred one. Historians have called this the first proto-crusade in history. Heraclius used every coin to build something new, a leaner, faster Roman army, built around heavy cataphract cavalry, capable of matching the Persian Aswaran at close quarters, an army that would not break and run, an army he himself would lead from the front, in the field, in open battle. Beginning in 622 AD, Heraclius started fighting back. Not defensively, not trying to hold lines or protect cities, but aggressively, striking deep into Persian-held territory, raiding, maneuvering, drawing Persian commanders out and defeating them in detail. He destroyed the great Zoroastrian fire temple of Adur-Gushnasp at Takhti Suleiman, the sacred equivalent for the Persians of losing Jerusalem. He shattered Persian army after Persian army in the mountains of Armenia and the plains of Iran. He showed a tactical genius that his enemies had not expected and could not counter, feigning retreats to draw pursuers into prepared killing grounds, launching night attacks against encamped forces, moving his army with a speed that repeatedly wrong-footed Persian commanders. In 626, Khosrau made his last great gamble. He coordinated a simultaneous assault on Constantinople by land and sea. His Persian army encamped at Chalcedon, a massive Avar and Slav force hammering the European walls. For weeks, Constantinople burned from outside. Inside, Patriarch Sergius carried an icon of the Virgin Mary along the walls every morning, and the city held. Byzantine warships controlled the Bosphorus, preventing the Persians from crossing. The Avar and Slavic boats that attempted to coordinate the assault on the sea walls were destroyed or driven off, and within days, the entire Allied assault collapsed. The Avars retreated. The Persian army at Chalcedon stood idle, cut off by water. The last coordinated effort to destroy Constantinople had failed, and Heraclius responded in the most unexpected way possible. In mid-September 627 AD, he did not march west to reclaim Asia Minor. He did not march south to retake Syria or Egypt or Jerusalem. He turned his army east, directly into the Persian heartland, into Mesopotamia, into Assyria, toward Ctesiphon itself. He had tens of thousands of his own troops and an alliance with a large Gokturk cavalry force. The Turks, unaccustomed to the brutal Mesopotamian winter, deserted almost immediately. Heraclius pressed on alone. No supply lines, no relief armies, no safe retreat if things went wrong. Military historian Edward Luttwak, in his study of Byzantine grand strategy, characterized Heraclius's approach as a high-risk strategic maneuver designed to bypass Persian strength entirely and strike directly at Persian will, exploiting years of conditioning the Persians to expect his raids to stop short of their heartland, until the moment when he did not stop at all. He advanced south through Persian territory at speed, stripping the land of every source of food and fodder as he went, leaving nothing for the Persian army tracking behind him. Because there was a Persian army tracking behind him, a battle-hardened force of approximately 12,000 men under one of Persia's finest commanders, an Armenian general in Persian service. His name was Razad, and he was coming. On the 1st of December 627 AD, Heraclius crossed the Great Zab River and made camp. On the horizon, half buried under centuries of sand and silence, stood the ruins of one of the oldest cities in the history of the world, Nineveh, the graveyard of an empire about to become the graveyard of another. Behind the Roman column, the army had left a trail of scorched villages, emptied granaries and stripped orchards, not out of spite, out of calculation. Every field burned, every grain store emptied, every well fouled, was one less source of supply for the man following them, because someone was following them, and that man was very good at his job. His name was Razad, rendered in some sources as Rokvehan, or Razates in Byzantine chronicles. He was an Armenian general serving the Persian crown, appointed personally by Khosrow II as the commander charged with stopping the Roman invasion. We know relatively little about his personal history compared to the emperors and kings who dominate the surviving sources, but what the chronicles do reveal is consistent. Razad was experienced, aggressive, and dangerous. He commanded a force of approximately 12,000 men, seasoned professionals, Azwaran heavy cavalry and Persian infantry who had spent years on campaign. And he was tracking the Roman army with methodical patience, step by step, through the winding terrain of northern Mesopotamia. The landscape they moved through was brutal in December. The fertile plains of Assyria, rich in the growing season, turned treacherous in winter. The rain season had begun. Wadis, dry riverbeds for most of the year, filled with fast, cold water and became obstacles that could swallow a column of cavalry. The ground around the Tigris and its tributaries turned soft and heavy with mud that caked into horseshoes and dragged at boots. Temperatures dropped sharply after nightfall. The Roman soldiers, many recruited from Anatolia and the Balkans, were better suited to cold than their Persian opponents, but it was grinding work all the same, marching in full equipment through rain and darkness with the knowledge that the enemy was somewhere behind them in the grey. Heraclius was moving in a direction no one had predicted. Conventional strategic logic in Mesopotamia pointed south, toward Ctesiphon, towards the capital, towards the greatest prize. Persian defensive planning was built around that assumption. Every major road garrison, every prepared defensive line, every reinforcement route was oriented to block a southward Roman advance along the Tigris. Heraclius had spent years conditioning that assumption. He had raided, he had probed. And then, in the autumn of 627, he drove east into the Assyrian heartland, crossing the Great Zab, camping near the ancient ruins of Nineveh on the eastern bank of the Tigris, in a movement that wrong-footed the entire Persian defensive network. Razad, to his credit, was not confused for long. He did not blunder into a prepared position. He approached Nineveh moving to intercept rather than simply pursue, trying to get ahead of the Roman column and force battle on ground of his own choosing. It was a sound instinct, but Heraclius was already thinking 2 moves ahead. The Romans knew that Razad was coming, and they knew something else. News arrived at the Roman camp that 3,000 Persian reinforcements were marching to link up with Razad before battle. Heraclius could not allow that junction. His own army had already been reduced significantly by the desertion of his Gokturk allies, who had melted away into the north once the Mesopotamian winter closed in, unaccustomed and unwilling to fight in conditions so different from the open Central Asian steppe. Without them, a further addition to Razad's force was a threat he could not ignore. His response was swift and calculated. He sent a detachment of Roman cavalry under a commander named Barnes to intercept and harry Razad, slow his advance, disrupt his reconnaissance, and prevent the reinforcements from making contact. The skirmish that followed was small but significant. Roman forces killed and captured a number of Persians, including, and this mattered enormously, Razad's personal aide. That man, under interrogation, confirmed the reinforcement timeline. Heraclius now had exact intelligence. He knew the size of the approaching force, he knew when it was expected to arrive, and he knew that if he did not force battle before it came, the balance of strength would shift against him. He also made a calculated feint. To conceal his true intentions from Razad and prevent the Persian commander from reading his movements, Heraclius gave the outward appearance of retreating, crossing back over the Tigris River as if withdrawing. It was a piece of theater designed for one audience, Razad. Let the Persian think the Roman was nervous, pulling back, choosing safety over engagement. Let him advance into the open ground without caution. Let him believe the fog was his friend. It was not going to be his friend. Heraclius had already chosen his ground. Scholar Walter Kaegi, one of the foremost modern academic authorities on Heraclius's Mesopotamian campaign, concluded in his detailed study that the battle most likely took place on the plain near Karamles Creek, west of the Great Zab, and some distance from the old ruins themselves, the name Battle of Nineveh being a geographical marker rather than a precise location. The site was chosen with cold professional expertise. It was open, flat ground, a plain that stretched wide enough to maneuver large bodies of cavalry. It was close enough to water for the horses to drink before the fight. And critically, it stripped away the Persian army's most potent long-range advantage. The Sassanid military system was built around layers of firepower. Persian armies at this period deployed thousands of skilled mounted and dismounted archers who could release a sustained barrage capable of disorganizing any cavalry charge before it reached close-quarters combat. The heavy Aswaran cataphracts were the hammer, but the arrows were what set up the blow. Against an enemy standing in the open at range, those archers were devastating. Against a Roman force that closed rapidly in the dark and fog before the archers could range their targets, they were almost useless. And on the morning of December 12, 627 AD, the plain of Nineveh was covered in exactly that, a thick, cold, blinding fog. Heraclius looked out at it and understood immediately what it meant. It was not a problem to be worked around. It was a weapon to be used. He gave the order to prepare for battle. On the other side of the fog-drenched plain, 12,000 Persian soldiers deployed into their formations, following Razad's orders, dressing their lines, knocking arrows, and waiting for the grey curtain of morning to lift so they could see what they were facing. It lifted, and by then the Romans were already moving. The morning of December 12th, 627 AD. The fog is not just atmospheric, it is operational. It is a weapon, and Heraclius holds it. Razad deployed his forces in 3 dense formations, 3 masses of men and horses, arranged in what the Byzantine sources describe as structures similar to phalanxes. 3 heavy blocks of Sassanid military power, dressed in their lines, armored, armed, and advancing. To any soldier standing in those ranks that morning, this was a textbook opening. 3 formations meant mutual support. 3 formations meant if one was disrupted, the others could wheel and cover. It was disciplined. It was professional. Razad was not a man who made obvious mistakes, but the fog that robbed his archers of their targets was only the first problem. The second problem was the ground Heraclius had chosen, flat, open, with no useful terrain for archers to dominate. The third problem was the Romans themselves. The Byzantine army Heraclius had built over nearly 17 years of war was not the old late Roman infantry force of the early empire. It was a cavalry-heavy, fast-moving, cataphract-centered force modeled in part on the Persian military system it had spent years studying and fighting. His soldiers wore lamellar armor over chainmail, carried long contos lances, and were trained for the kind of close-quarters shock combat that decided battles in seconds, not minutes. Heraclius had recruited from the Balkans, from Anatolia, from Armenia, from every corner of what remained of the Roman world. The men around him that morning were veterans. They had marched hundreds of miles through hostile territory in brutal winter conditions. They were exhausted, hungry, and far from home. They were also among the most battle-hardened soldiers on earth. Razad attacked first. His 3 formations moved forward across the plain, closing the distance in the thinning fog. The Persian advance was measured, controlled. A commander who was not reckless, who wanted to see the Roman response before committing everything. Heraclius gave him a response he did not expect. He feigned retreat. This was not panic. This was a tactic Heraclius had used before and used brilliantly, luring the enemy forward, off their prepared ground, onto terrain of his own selection, drawing their formations out of alignment and then reversing. The Persians saw the Roman cavalry pulling back, the lines compressing, the movement suggesting withdrawal. They advanced more aggressively, closing faster. Razad's 3 masses pushed forward onto the open plain, and then the Romans turned. The reversal was sudden and violent. Heraclius swung his cavalry around and drove into the advancing Persian formations at the full charge. The contos' lances came down, the horses hit their stride, and on that flat, fog-damped plain outside the ruins of Nineveh, the 2 armies collided in a crash of steel and bone that the sources tell us lasted uninterrupted for 8 hours. 8 hours of heavy cavalry combat is almost impossible to imagine. This was not a skirmish. This was not a brief, decisive shock engagement that ended in minutes with one side routing. This was grinding, sustained, murderous close-quarters fighting, dismounting, reforming, charging again. Horses collapsed from exhaustion and wounds. Men fought on foot when their animals went down. The plain turned into a churning chaos of blood, mud, and broken equipment. Formations that had started the morning in disciplined lines dissolved into clusters of men fighting individual duels, while their commanders tried desperately to maintain any coherent order. The Persian advantage in missile troops was almost entirely neutralized. The fog had removed their ability to range and volley at distance before contact. The flat ground removed any elevated firing positions, and once the two sides closed to melee range, which happened fast, given that Heraclius charged rather than stood, the archers became near useless. A Persian mounted archer in the middle of a cavalry melee with Romans fighting at arm's length on every side could not draw and loose without risking hitting his own men. The Assyrian heavy cavalry, those terrifying armored horsemen who had rampaged across Syria and Egypt, were exactly what their Roman counterparts were. They could be killed, and they were being killed. At some point during those 8 brutal hours, the sources do not give us an exact moment, only the context of a battle already deeply fought, both sides already bloodied and exhausted. The character of the engagement changed. Ragzad rode to the front of his army. What exactly drove this decision, we cannot know with certainty. The sources record the outcome, not the psychology behind it, but we can reason from the facts. The battle had been going on for hours. The Persian formations were not winning. Ragzad's archers were ineffective. His heavy cavalry were being fought to a standstill by Romans who were fighting with a ferocity and discipline he had not expected from an exhausted army at the end of a brutal winter march. His reinforcements, 3,000 men he had been waiting for, had not arrived. He could feel the momentum of the battle shifting. He could see, across the churning plain, the figure of the Roman emperor himself, Heraclius, fighting in the front line, where Roman emperors almost never went, leading his cavalry from the front rather than directing from the rear. Ragzad made a decision. He rode out from the Persian lines and issued a challenge. This practice, single combat between champions or between commanders, had deep roots in the ancient and medieval military tradition of the Near East. It was not irrational. It was a recognized, culturally understood gesture, one warrior addressing another directly, over the heads of their armies, settling the matter between the two men most responsible for it. For Ragzad, at the moment he issued it, it may have been his best remaining option. Kill the Emperor of Rome in front of both armies, and the battle ends instantly. The Romans lose their commander, their inspiration, their supreme authority in one stroke. They are 1,200 miles from home. Without Heraclius, they have no reason to stand and every reason to run. It was a rational calculation. It was also a death sentence. Heraclius answered, "Now, before we go further, I have to be honest with you about something because this channel is about the brutal truth, and that means the truth about the sources too. What happened in the next few minutes was recorded by 2 Byzantine writers, Nikephoros in his short history and Theophanes the Confessor in his chronicle. Both are essential sources for this period, but both were writing in the early 9th century, roughly 180 years after the battle. They are not eyewitnesses. They are not writing within living memory. They are drawing on earlier chronicles, many of which are now lost, and their accounts differ in important details. In Nikephoros' version, one of Heraclius's bodyguards rode forward first and struck Ragzad's shoulder with his sword. Then Heraclius closed in, speared him, and cut off his head. In Theophanes' version, Heraclius personally fought 3 Persian opponents in sequence, throwing down the first, overcoming the second, and killing the third, despite taking a spear to the lip. A later Persian tradition preserves a different angle still. Heraclius issued the challenge himself, was wounded on the lip, and killed a Sassanid champion in single combat. The scholarly debate over which version is closest to what actually happened has never been fully resolved. What the traditions broadly agree on is this: the emperor of the Roman Empire, in his early 50s, personally entered the fighting at the climax of an 8-hour battle. He received a wound to the lip. He kept going, and a high-ranking Persian opponent died in the clash. In one version, that opponent is clearly Razad himself. In another, the sequence is less certain. What is not in doubt is the trophy Heraclius carried from the field, a shield of 120 gold plates and a gold breastplate, stripped from the body of a senior Persian commander and held up in front of both armies. These were not the equipment of an ordinary soldier. They were the regalia of a Persian nobleman of the highest rank, a commander who wore his status on his body, whose armor was itself a declaration of prestige and power. And Heraclius held it up on that blood-soaked plain for every soldier on both sides to see. In one later Byzantine tradition, the fight did not end with Razad. A second Persian opponent rode forward, then a third. In this account, Heraclius met all of them. None of them prevailed. Whether that is exactly how it unfolded, or whether later storytellers added layers to an already extraordinary event, we cannot say for certain. What we can say is that by the time the fighting around Heraclius was done, every Persian who had come forward to challenge the Emperor of Rome was dead or defeated. With Razad dead and Persian morale badly shaken after hours of grinding combat, the army could no longer hold the initiative. The Persians withdrew toward the nearby foothills, leaving Heraclius in control of the field. 6,000 Persians fell on the plain of Nineveh, according to Byzantine sources, among them Razad himself and a number of senior officers. The 3,000 reinforcements that Razad had been waiting for arrived to find the battle already over. Their commander was dead. There was nothing left to reinforce. Heraclius held the field. After 25 years of war, a 17-year rebuilding effort, 5 campaign seasons in enemy territory, and 8 hours of the most savage fighting of the entire conflict, the Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire stood on the plain outside Nineveh, blood on his face, his enemy's golden armor in his hands, and not a single Persian army left in the field to stop him. When you are doing the kind of deep research that goes into a video like this, cross-referencing Byzantine chronicles, academic papers, and primary sources from across multiple countries, the last thing you need is to worry about who is watching your connection or blocking your access to material. NordVPN gives you military-grade encryption on up to 10 devices simultaneously, thousands of servers worldwide, and a strict no-logs policy, meaning what you look at is your business and nobody else's. Whether you are traveling, working from a public network, or just value your privacy as a basic principle, NordVPN is the tool I personally use and trust. Check the description for the current offer. Stay safe online. Now, back to the fall of an empire. Razad was dead. The plain of Nineveh belonged to Rome, and the consequences began to cascade through the Persian Empire like cracks running through old stone. There was no Persian army left between Heraclius and Ctesiphon, not one organized, field-ready force capable of blocking the road south. The garrisons of individual towns and forts could shut their gates and wait, but they could not stop an army moving in the open country. The entire Western defensive architecture of the Sassanid Empire, built around the assumption that a Roman invader would be met and ground down before reaching the heartland, had been dismantled in a single morning's fighting outside the ruins of a city that had been dead for over 1,000 years. Khosrow II soon understood what Nineveh meant. As Heraclius advanced toward Dastagerd and the metropolitan region of the capital, the King of Kings fled, heading toward the mountains of Susiana, trying to preserve whatever remained of his power. The man who had taken Jerusalem and stood his campfires on the shores of the Bosphorus was running. without an army, without a general, without a plan that had any real prospect of success. Heraclius did not march immediately on Ctesiphon. There was a practical reason. The Narawan Canal, the great irrigation canal running south of the capital, had been made impassable by the collapse of a bridge, cutting off the direct approach to the city. Heraclius lacked the siege equipment to force a defended crossing against the garrison still holding the walls. Ctesiphon itself, one of the greatest cities in the world and the political heart of the Sassanid Empire, would remain beyond Heraclius's reach. But Heraclius did not need Ctesiphon. He had already won. Instead, he turned his army toward Dastagerd, the enormous royal palace complex of Khosrow II, located northeast of Ctesiphon, one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. When his soldiers entered it, the scene they found defied description. Khosrow, in his haste to flee, had left behind almost everything. The storehouses and treasure rooms of Dastagerd contained the accumulated wealth of decades of Persian conquest and tribute. 300 captured Roman military standards, the eagles and banners of units defeated and humiliated over a quarter-century of war, were recovered and carried out by Roman soldiers who understood exactly what they were holding. Alongside them, aloe wood, silk, sugar, ginger, and exotic goods from as far away as China and India filled the royal warehouses. But the most significant thing that happened after Nineveh was not in the treasury of a palace. It happened in the Persian army itself. The soldiers and commanders of the Sassanid military had spent 25 years fighting this war. They had been brilliant and effective and had conquered more Roman territory in a generation than any Persian force in history. And now, their last field commander was dead, their king had fled, their capital was unthreatened only because a Roman emperor had been stopped by a canal rather than by Persian valor. And Khosrow was still issuing orders from hiding, demanding the defense of positions that could not be defended, sending dispatches that reflected no understanding of the catastrophe that had occurred. The Persian army had reached its limit. In February 628 AD, barely 2 months after the Battle of Nineveh, the Sassanid military rebelled. Khosrow II was arrested by his own soldiers and brought before his own son, Kavad II, known in Byzantine sources as Siroes, who had seized power with the support of the Persian nobility and military command. Khosrow was not simply deposed. He was imprisoned in a dungeon, stripped of everything and subjected to a death that was deliberate and drawn out. According to the sources, he was kept alive for 5 days on the bare minimum of sustenance, just enough to sustain consciousness, not enough to preserve dignity. On the 5th day, he was shot to death with arrows. Multiple shots, none of them immediately fatal, each one watched by his jailers until, eventually, the King of Kings of the greatest empire in the world was dead on a dungeon floor. The Sassanid dynasty had ruled Persia for over 400 years, beginning with its founder Ardashir I, who overthrew the Parthian king in 224 AD and established the empire. His son, Shapur I, had cemented that power by defeating and capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, the first and only Roman emperor ever taken alive in battle, who spent the rest of his life as a Persian prisoner. Rome had never avenged that humiliation until now. 400 years of conflict between the two superpowers of the ancient world ended in a dungeon in the Persian capital in the spring of 628 AD, with an arrow in a king's chest. Kavad II immediately sent peace envoys to Heraclius. He had no choice, and he knew it. Heraclius, equally aware that his own empire was at the edge of physical collapse, did not squeeze for maximum concessions. He was interested in a settlement that both empires could survive. The terms of the peace, concluded in 628 AD, were a restoration of the pre-war status quo. All conquered territories were returned. All Roman prisoners held by Persia were released, and the true cross was returned. The relic that Sassanid soldiers had packed onto wagons in the ruins of Jerusalem in 614 AD, the most sacred object in the Christian world, captured as a trophy of the greatest Persian triumph, was handed back to Heraclius in a ceremony that Byzantine sources describe with barely contained reverence. Heraclius carried it personally back to Jerusalem in March 630 AD, entering the Holy City on foot, and restoring it to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in a moment his contemporaries understood as the fulfillment of a divine mission. God had not abandoned Rome after all, but the celebration was shorter than anyone could have known. Both empires had been bled white. The Byzantine Empire had survived, but it had done so by spending every reserve, borrowing against its future, and throwing its last resources into a generation of total war. The provincial populations of Syria and Egypt, many of whom were non-Chalcedonian Christians who had been in theological conflict with Constantinople for over a century, had lived under Persian occupation for a generation and were not eager to pay heavy taxes to a government that had failed to protect them. The loyalty of the eastern provinces to Constantinople was fractured in ways that no map could show. Persia was in even worse shape. The death of Khosrow II did not stabilize the empire. It triggered a political catastrophe that tore it apart. Kavad II died of plague just months after taking power. Between 628 AD and 632 AD, 4 years, the Sassanid throne changed hands no fewer than 12 times. 12 different rulers, some reigning for only weeks, fighting over the wreckage of an empire whose army had been destroyed, whose treasury had been looted, and whose nobility had been fractured by decades of internal conflict. The Sassanid Empire was not just weakened after Nineveh, it was structurally broken, a hollow shell that looked from the outside like it might still be a great power, but inside had nothing left. And into that hollow space, from the deserts of Arabia, came something neither empire had seen coming. The first Arab-Muslim armies crossed into Persian territory in 633 AD, barely 5 years after the Battle of Nineveh. The Sassanid Empire, which had matched Rome blow for 4 centuries, collapsed before them in less than 20 years. The Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 AD shattered the last serious Sassanid field army. Ctesiphon fell in 637 AD, taken by Arab forces who had never, as a political entity, existed as a military threat until a decade before. The last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, was murdered by a miller in 651 AD, hiding in a barn in the far east of his former empire. The 400-year Sassanid Empire was gone. The Byzantine Empire lasted longer. It would endure for another 8 centuries until the Ottoman capture of Constantinople in 1453 AD. But its eastern provinces were already going. Syria fell to the Arabs in 636 AD, Palestine in 637, Egypt in 641 AD, the year Heraclius himself died, watching from Constantinople as the empire he had spent his life saving lost the provinces he had spent his life recovering. Jerusalem, which he had restored the true cross to with his own hands just 11 years earlier, was in Arab-Muslim hands by the end of 637 AD. Heraclius died on February 11th, 641 AD, in Constantinople. He had been emperor for 31 years. He had taken the throne of a dying empire, rebuilt it from nothing, defeated the most powerful military force in the world in its own heartland, recovered the true cross, and brought the Roman Empire back to its ancient boundaries in the Middle East. And then he had watched, in the final years of his life, as a new force swept away everything he had won. History is not a story that ends cleanly. The Battle of Nineveh was a real, documented, extraordinary victory. The personal combat of Heraclius at Nineveh, preserved in two separate 9th-century Byzantine accounts, ultimately drawing on earlier and now lost sources, remains one of the most dramatic moments in the history of any war anywhere in the ancient world, even as scholars debate the precise details of what happened. Heraclius was, by any measure, one of the greatest soldier emperors of the ancient and medieval worlds combined. His campaign of 627 to 628 AD is studied in military history to this day as a model of strategic maneuver, logistics, and psychological warfare. But the victory was also a Pyrrhic masterpiece. Rome and Persia had fought their final war to the point of mutual exhaustion. They had destroyed each other's capacity to resist what came next. The Battle of Nineveh did not save the ancient world. It ended it. On a plain near the Tigris River, in the cold December fog of 627 AD, a Roman emperor in his early 50s, blood on his face, his enemy's golden armor in his hands, stood at the center of one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of warfare. Whether the duel unfolded exactly as later chroniclers described, or whether the story grew in the telling over the following centuries, does not diminish what is certain. Heraclius personally fought at the climax of an 8-hour battle, deep in enemy territory, 1,200 miles from home, took a wound to the face, and came away holding the armor of the man who had been sent to destroy him. Do not let the bittersweet aftermath wash out the color of the thing itself. Two great civilizations, the Eastern Roman and the Sassanid Persian, spent each other into the ground over a generation of total war and left a power vacuum that changed the world forever. The Battle of Nineveh did not save the ancient world, but it was the moment one extraordinary man stood at its edge and refused, one last time, to let it fall without a fight. That is the brutal truth of Nineveh. If you made it to the end of this video, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Drop a comment below. I want to know, do you think Heraclius personally fought Razad in single combat, as the later Byzantine chronicles describe? Or do you think the story was shaped by later writers turning a brutal, chaotic cavalry battle into something more legendary? Let me know your take. Like this video if it earned it. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deserve to know this history. Subscribe if you are not already, and hit the notification bell so you do not miss what is coming next. The Wars in History library is deep, and we are just getting started. I will see you in the next one.